Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Today, we are presenting an interview with Barbara Oakley, author of Uncommon Sense Teaching and Learning Like a Pro. My name is Lori Burris, and I'm the Education Innovation Advisor at LinkedIn Learning, the leading provider of learning online videos, and I'll be moderating the discussion. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Don't worry, we'll be sending out an on-demand recording of this webinar as soon as it's available. Any presentation decks or additional materials will be sent to you as well. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. And if you can't find that, put them in chat. We have a moderator looking at chat. We'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll also have time for questions at the end. I encourage social sharing with your audience members. You can always use hashtag HEDleaders. And for those of you just joining us for the first time, welcome and know that we love hearing from you. Today, the format is a conversation, a dialogue, followed by questions. Now, without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about Barbara because there's a lot to say. Barbara is a distinguished professor of engineering at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Michigan's Distinguished Professor of the Year, and Coursera's inaugural innovation instructor. Her work focuses on the complex relationship between neuroscience and social behavior. Dr. Oakley's research has been described as revolutionary in the Wall Street Journal. She is a New York Times best-selling author who has published in outlets as valued as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Together with Terence Shednowski, the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute, she co-teaches Coursera, UC San Diego's Learning How to Learn, one of the world's most popular massive open online courses with over 3 million registered students, along with a number of other leading MOOCs. She has won numerous teaching awards, including the American Society of Engineering, Education's Chester F. Carlson Award for Technical Innovation and Engineering Education, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers William E. Sale II Award for Achievement in Education. She has adventured widely through her lifetime. I'm sure she will weave it into her answers today. She rose from the ranks of private to captain in the US Army, during which time she was recognized as a distinguished military scholar. She also worked as a communications expert at the South Pole Station in Antarctica and has served as a Russian translator on board Soviet trawlers on the Bering Sea. Dr. Oakley is an elected fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering and of the Institute of Electrical and and the American Institute for Medical and I'm screwing this up. And of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers and the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. I'm so happy to welcome you here today, Barbara. If there's anything I've left out and you want to say more about it, feel fine. But if you haven't gotten it, she's a polymath. How many languages do you speak, Barbara?
Oh, no, just like 1.5 down. My Russian's pretty rusty, and I'm working on Spanish, so maybe like one.
So am I. Why? I grew up in Arizona and I took French. I feel like I didn't get guided properly. Like Spanish would have been so helpful.
My son-in-law is from Chile, and so our daughter and my son-in-law speak Spanish at home. So it's kind of like, gotta keep up with the Jones. So I want to, keep going with my Spanish studies.
So I wanted you to see all of the books that Barbara's written about education. She's written more than this. She's even written fictional books, but the latest book is Uncommon Sense Teaching and Learn Like a Pro. Learn Like a Pro, I've actually handed out to everyone in my design pedagogy at the University of Southern California. It just said, take this. It's a 1.5 hour read. It's really your guidebook. And many of the illustrations that I'll be showing today are part of the Uncommon Sense Teaching book and the course. And Barbara has made them available on her website, which I have linked up there. And I wanted you to know her downloads are there for faculty and students and institutions to use, which is a valuable resource. So my first question to you, at the heart of understanding how we learn is understanding how the brain works behind the scenes while we're learning. Would you explain the focused and diffused modes in our brain and what part they play in learning?
Oh, absolutely. So here, this is actually important in understanding why I, as a child, flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science. I was absolutely horrible at them. And it was only later when I was 26 and I was trying to retrain my brain, because I began to realize that by following my passion and simply learning a language as my sole professional expertise, there was just not that much call for people whose sole expertise was Slavic languages and literature. And what I should have been doing all the way along was not just following my passion in learning, but actually broadening my passions in learning. But what crippled my ability to begin thinking I could be successful in math and science was that when I first sat down to do something, like in my case, I was 7 years old, I was starting to learn the multiplication tables, and and I couldn't do it. I just thought, this doesn't really make sense to me. I can't really, it's simple. We're talking simple stuff, multiplication tables. I couldn't remember it very easily. It didn't seem applicable to the modern world. And other people were way ahead of me in knowing what to do with the multiplication and so forth. And what I didn't understand was that for anybody, when you first sit down and start trying to learn something, it's often like it doesn't go so fast. And sure, for a tiny percentage of learners who have drawbacks as a consequence of this, there can be, they can learn really fast. But other people learn more slowly, but what they do is like they practice a lot more on their own than they let on. So it seems like they learn really fast, when actually they have to do a lot of practicing. But the main thing is that people will sit down to try and learn something and they don't realize that they have to try to focus on it. And then they need to take a break when they get stuck, and they need to go into the diffuse mode. So I'm trying to show with these two illustrations that Lori so kindly brought up, your working memory is kind of like that octopus that you see on the left. And it's trying to hook things together, but it's only on average got like 4 arms. So it's more like a quadrupus than an octopus. It can only link together so much. And you have to kind of go away, take a break, and then when you're not thinking about these ideas, you go into what I call the diffuse mode, but what neuroscientists call the default mode network, or psychologists will call the task negative network. And this is a time when you're not thinking about that task. In fact, you're mentally relaxing. And what can happen during that time is you start to make all these nice connections, and you think you're not doing anything, because you're not conscious of what's going on in the background. But when you take this little mental break after you've initially focused and tried to put something together and maybe gotten frustrated, you take this little break, and then when you come back, all of a sudden it starts to slowly make more sense. So you may have to go back and forth between focusing and then taking a break in diffuse mode several times. But each time you come back, it will start to make more and more sense. And that diffuse mode or something similar to the default network happens even as we're falling asleep, or when we're taking a walk or taking a shower or riding on a bus. This little break period is actually a really important part of learning. And if I'd known about this when I was a little girl and I moved from Texas to Massachusetts, and they were suddenly way far ahead of me on the multiplication tables, if I'd simply known that it was okay to not be able to figure things out really quickly, I would have done so much better. So anyway, I think this is a critically important idea to impart to students as well.
I think so too, because we've all felt stuck. And if we'd just known that we could go take a walk, or, rest up, or move away, that our brain would still be working. And as you can see from your illustrations, working all over the brain. It's associating memories, events, looking for anything to try to put that together, which you don't do, as you said, in focus mode. It's what you repeat the same steps, trying to figure out where you're going wrong. What are some of the ways that teachers can use practical insights from neuroscience to make dramatic improvements in their students' ability to learn? I mean, teachers are always concerned about students keeping it in their memory or having it there available to them.
So what we've been told for the last 20, 30 years is you don't need to remember anything because you can always look it up. And knowing things like, learning the multiplication tables is not suitable. It's a waste of memory room because you can always look up the multiplication tables. Well, this kind of thing is a deeply erroneous approach to understanding how we learn that has grown out of the fact that for a long time, psychologists simply couldn't look into the brain. But now that we're getting a much better understanding of what happens in the brain when we learn, we're actually making links between neurons. So if you look at the top, there's like a neuron. You don't have to remember all this stuff about dendritic spines or axons or anything like that. But basically, the arm of one neuron reaches out and touches the toe, a toe on the end of the next neuron. That's the dendritic spine. So you've got this axon, the bouton at the end comes up and butts against a dendritic spine on the next neuron. And you make a little set of connections when you learn anything. And these connections are in long-term memory. And if you don't have them in long-term memory, you actually don't know it. You can conveniently kind of think you know things because you can look at a paper right in front of you, or you've got it temporarily in your hippocampus, so you think you've got it. But making those sets of neural connections, which we often abbreviate with those little sets of dots, is something that we often, that neuroscientists often do, to illustrate the idea that as we're learning, we're simply connecting neurons together. And the more we practice, the more certain connections will strengthen, others will weaken. And that engram, that memory in the neocortex is what we've learned. So if you, for example, one student in one of my classes, I remember him coming up, and it was a statistics exam, and I'd handed them back, and his was just covered with red ink. He'd flunked the test. And he said to me, "I just don't understand how I could have flunked this test. I understood it when you said it in class." And the problem is that we've gotten so overboard with this idea that conceptual understanding is key to everything that we forget that unless you have it in long-term memory, it doesn't matter if you understood something temporarily. You have to have it in long-term memory. So for those who are like, no, you can always look it up. I mean, would you speak French if you used Google Translate? If for you to understand the fundamental patterns within mathematics, you need to have it within you those fundamental ideas, or like the patterns of addition and of the multiplication tables. And when you get those within you, it becomes far easier to learn things like fractions and algebra and so forth. How is this relevant to what you are doing now on your job? Let's say that you're learning coding. And let's say there's a series of hotkeys that allow you to much more swiftly act as a coder, in doing whatever you're doing. You might think, oh, I can always just look those up. Well, yeah, you can. But the hallmark of really expert coders is they're really swift. They incorporate those hotkeys into their brain. They learn them by heart. So they're really quick, really automatic. And this is extremely helpful for learning. So do not discount the importance of seemingly rote knowledge, which is the creation of sets of neural links, often through the procedural system of the basal ganglia in long-term memory. And these memories are what are going to help you to act swiftly and surely and intuitively in your work.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, think about the first time you tried to parallel park a car. You had to break it down step by step by step, and you had to have a teacher guide you through it, and you had to practice it. But now, if you've been driving for 20 years, you have a sense when there's something that you need to look up and notice. And it's from years and years of experience, and those experiences build up. I think it's really important. And also students tend to think, like your student, I get it, or I've crammed for the test, and that's enough. And yet we know when we've done studies on students who cram for tests that 6 months later, and you give them the same test, they don't do very well because they don't have it in really built up. They really haven't built the memory. So one of the things that I liked in your new book and your new course is that you have this phrase that you repeat at every moment that you can: learn it, link it. And you have it connected to also the way we can teach students: I do, we do, you do, and extend it. And I thought you could just talk about how you picked that phrase and why it's so important to kind of make it a mantra for learning in a classroom.
So this question links well with the question that came up just now on chat, which is, how do we best generate those extra or those long-term connections in long-term memory? And so embedded within what I'm going to talk to you about is the idea of retrieval practice. So let me explain how that relates to what's going on here with this I do, we do, you do extended. So this is something like geared to help teachers understand how to teach material, but it also helps us to understand how we as students can help best learn the material. So as you're learning something, you are creating these weak sets of links in long-term memory. So for example, right now, I'm explaining something to you. And that is actually kind of knitting together these really, really weak sets of links in long-term memory. Now, there's also the hippocampus. So there's like some ways of looking at it is the brain has two major learning systems. One is long-term memory, and the other is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is like this coach. You've got your working memory here, you've got your coach right here. Here's our working memory is the octopus. But if we might go back a slide. So what is happening is when I teach you something, it goes through your working memory, through the hippocampus, and makes these weak sets of links in the we do section. So it's, in other words, it's just creating these weak links. And your hippocampus actually has stronger links. So it's like this intermediary. And whenever you take a break, here's what's happening. Your working memory or your conscious awareness is talking to the hippocampus. And whenever your working memory shuts up, like the teacher shuts up, then your hippocampus can turn to long-term memory and start saying, hey, you know what she just said? Here's the thing, and it will reinforce those sets of links in long-term memory. And that is what we call, or what teachers often call the you do. That's when you're not getting input from someone else. You're able to think about something either because you're not getting input or because you're actively solving a problem. And then the more you practice with these problems, the stronger those sets of links. That's what we call extended. And it will also kind of hook in with other links. So when we say learn it, link it, what we're actually meaning is get that initial information, form those few, those weak links to start with as someone explains things to you, and then go off on your own, practice and strengthen those sets of links, through your own practice. One story that I really think is so pertinent involves my favorite athlete of all time, Julius Yego. And Julius is from Kenya. If you know anything about Kenya, they're super famous for their long distance runners. Well, the thing is, Julius didn't want to be a long distance runner. And he wanted to learn to throw the javelin really well. But there were no javelin throwing coaches to really speak of in all of Kenya. And he couldn't afford to go overseas to study. So instead, Julius just went to YouTube and started watching really good teachers of the javelin on YouTube. And 98% of the time, simply by watching these great online teachers and then going out and practicing on his own. So he was learning it and then linking it through practice. He became the world champion in throwing the javelin, which is, if I hadn't said this story, you would have said, there's no way you could learn a sport online. But Julius did. And so that now, those who are always like a little biased against online learning, they might say, well, yeah, but that was just a sport, but actually learning a mental skill is really analogous to learning sports. And in some ways, online teaching allows you to learn, or learning allows you to learn even more easily than in face-to-face classrooms, because you're not having like these, I can't tell you, sometimes, I would be in classrooms, there's always a door banging or somebody's talking to somebody else, or, and there's all these distractions. Whereas when you can really look online on your own, you can really focus much better. And so, there's just so many great assets to online learning. I think we're going to get to that a little later.
Right, we will. And I wanted to know, it's had a huge impact on me. As I said, I teach at University of Southern California, and I've added a fourth column to my schedule called OYO, On Your Own. And every week they have what are they supposed to be doing on their own? What are they supposed to be practicing on their own? What problems, what projects? And you know what? I thought I didn't used to add it. I still gave those kinds of assignments by simply identifying this is what you need to do as yourself as a student, not with me, not with your classrooms. We're all available as resources if you need us. It really helped improve people's performance immensely, just by identifying that thing that you could do to help yourself. So thank you, Barbara. I thought you could go a little bit, this is kind of a complicated illustration, but I thought you could talk a little bit about how complicated it is with long-term and short-term memory and how that works for us.
Oh, okay. So this illustration, if you look, you can see that the octopus of working memory is like throwing this ball that's bouncing around in your head. And it's working memory, that octopus can only hold a few pieces of information, and those are symbolized by those balls. On average, we can hold 4 balls of information, people in general. And if you get too much information going on at once in your working memory, everything can fall out. So for example, I can tell you that, like, normally when you're driving a car, you're kind of on automatic mode. And so in other words, actually your procedural system is handling things. Your working memory is not really occupied much. You're just kind of keeping the car on the road. You don't have to think that much. Well, my father had 2 accidents in his entire life. And that was, both of them were when I was speaking with him. So what was happening was I was giving him, I was talking, his brain was engaging with me and not with what was going on in the environment around him. And so then when he didn't realize he was going too fast around a curve, boom, we hit a tree. So, so moral of the story is, don't distract people who are driving and doing things like turning into traffic or going around corners or something like that. But if you go forward to the next illustration, that really shows too much information it provides for cognitive overload. And this is why it's important when you're giving, when you're learning something, to try to like break it into pieces. So it's not too much and you don't feel overwhelmed with what you're learning. By the same token, I still remember I was trying to, when I was in my initial engineering studies, I remember reading this page and going, I am not going to turn the page until I understand this one chunk of information. And I sat there for like a couple hours, growing increasingly frustrated. And just before I just got up to walk away, I accidentally turned the page and it all fell together, because I hadn't, because I was being so careful about chunking everything. I didn't actually do what I should have done, which is kind of a picture walk through the chapter first to see if I could get a sense of the key ideas by looking at bolded words and figures and so forth, which is a really helpful approach for learning. If you're online, you're learning online, then it can be a really helpful thing to be able to look at the captions that are generated, especially if there's a separate caption list. So you can, and especially if it's like highlighted or there's a way to kind of look at those key ideas, because remember, those key ideas are what you're going to want to use as retrieval practice. So even if you're watching, let's say, a 10-minute video, stop the video at the end or even within and just ask yourself, what were the key ideas? And you are not just rote learning something with no understanding. Actually, research shows that you're learning better. Your understanding improves as you're using retrieval practice.
So I want to get into something that's really top of mind and important to us in education right now, to teach inclusively. What are some of the ways that will help teachers figure out how best to differentiate instruction to assist all the learners in their classroom? You do a lot of work in this course and in your book on this idea of how to address students that come with different experiences, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic, who have had different environments they live in. And the teachers faced with all of these different experiences that these students come in with, trying to help them all be good learners and be able to move forward. So can you give us some thoughts on that will help us from the neuroscientific point of view?
Oh, absolutely. So the issue is, now I'm going to make the case here that really fast learners have advantages and disadvantages, and slower learners have disadvantages and advantages. And now you're going to kind of think, well, it's Barb. She puts a smiley face on everything. But this is what I'm talking about, is from a neuroscientific and evolutionary perspective, really true, borne out by research. So if you're a fast learner, oftentimes what you have is a really good memory. So remember we talked about, how neural connections are made, and there's like these little spines that stick out of the dendrites called dendritic spines. And so what one neuron will do is it comes up and it hooks onto the dendritic spine. And well, it doesn't quite hook on. I mean, technically speaking, it's a synaptic gap between, the two neurons. But you can think of it as neurons are kind of hooking together. And it's by connecting these neurons together that you form memories. Now, really fast learners often have dendritic spines that are like super sturdy. They grow quickly into place, and at night, there's a bath of neurochemicals that washes away a lot of dendritic spines that are not being used. But in people with really good memories, they have a differing bath of neurochemicals that don't get washed away and, not as easily. So they retain memories, and they can really hold things, and they have the appearance, and they can be super fast learners. But the problem is, if you're a super fast learner, remember, it's because those little dendrites stay in place. They don't wash away, and it makes you less flexible. So
Huh.
you can be less flexible, and because you're less flexible, you're less accurate in your thinking. So I think we've all known really super smart people who jump to conclusions, and then when you try to say, look, you're wrong, and show evidence, they're like, sorry, they're not even going to pay attention to you. And so this, like my hero in science is Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who won the Nobel Prize and is now considered the father of modern neuroscience. And what Cajal said was, I was no genius, and he was not. I mean, he really struggled through elementary, middle, and high school, was kicked out. It was a terrible student. He said, I am no genius, but I have worked with many geniuses. And the problem with geniuses is they jump to conclusions, and when their hypothesis is wrong, they will use their prodigious intellects to justify why they must have been right after all, instead of simply saying, oh, my hypothesis was wrong. So if you are a slower learner, rejoice, because you can sometimes do things that even geniuses cannot.
Interesting. I'm definitely a hiker, but I have 2 children, and one is a race car driver and one's a hiker. And as you were describing the person who always defends their position, even when the ship is going down, that would be my son, who's got almost a photographic type memory, sees something once and can, like a mynah bird, spit it back. But my daughter's more like a dancer who has to practice and exercise. And you know what? What's interesting though, Barbara, about this is they can both get to the same spot. And I will use my example. 3 years ago, I hiked to Machu Picchu, and there was a 12-year-old boy in my team, and he would race for 15 minutes and take a break for 20 minutes, and race for 15 minutes and take a 20-minute break. And I just was slow and steady up the 12,000-foot descent. Guess what? We both arrived at the same time. This is the story of the turtle and the hare. So I think that's an important thing to say, that sometimes where we end up can be very different routes, and it isn't about the speed or acting smart. It's so important to address that. Do you have any other thoughts though about students who actually come into school or come into high school and college that haven't had some of the experiences that other learners have had, and how we can help them when they arrive like a first-gen student into college?
So for me, when I was 26, I went to the university and started with remedial high school algebra. And so I think one of the best things we can do for students is to give them remedial ways to like get on track with, to catch up with the other students. Because it's not fair to expect you to land like in first year calculus if you don't have the background to prepare yourself for it. But the great thing is that if you just scaffold, be patient with yourself. One thing that I did that was immensely helpful was I tried to ensure I didn't take as many classes as other people, at least not in the beginning, because it's demoralizing if you're a hiker learner, like I'm a hiker learner, you'll see some students taking 4 classes, working a job, speeding through their learning, and then you're like, oh, well, I'm an idiot. But actually, if you have more time, especially if you're a slower learner, you will find that you can learn that material even more deeply than the race car learners. So I think just being patient with yourself, and for administrators, providing avenues so that people can get the remedial background that they need, and also pushing K-12 systems to, at present, K-12 systems often simply do not use insights from neuroscience to help with teaching. So they don't use retrieval practice. In fact, practice in mathematics is sometimes deemed an anathema, which is directly, antithetical to what we know from neuroscience to be true. So, but just be patient and give yourself that extra background practice and training you will need at your age to catch up with the others. And whatever you need to do to keep yourself motivated, whether it's a sticky note of yourself, with a doctor gown picture on, or just telling yourself, I just have to get through this class. If you feel like an imposter, you have a better chance of doing better in the course. Because I can tell you, for example, in my engineering students, it's the ones that come in who are super cocky, think they know it all, as opposed to, for example, older students who come in and they're really nervous about whether they can actually succeed. It's these ones that are nervous and they're not sure they can do it. The ones who feel like imposters, those are the best students and the best engineers. So I always say, just learn to grow comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, and it will really be an asset for you.
Yeah, again, I've taken some really been inspired by you. And one of the things I introduced into my teaching was I realized that a lot of teachers teach in 2-week units. Like you have to do everything in 2 weeks. You present, you practice, test, present, test. And I started doing something what I called the stretchy timeline. If I thought that a third of my class was really struggling, then we stayed on it. And I found that it would accelerate the next part so that we didn't have to spend 2 weeks on it. We could spend 1 week on it. And that I still got the same amount of taught in those 15 weeks. But by stopping when people were having problems and letting us sort of really practice and address what was going on until we had some of what you call consolidation and understanding and in our long-term memory, we could actually speed forward in the next 2 or 3 steps. And that was a huge revelation to me. And I think to my students too, to be able to admit in class that I need a break. I need more time on this particular topic, feeling comfortable to announce that to other people in the classroom.
Yes.
We've been talking now for about 30 minutes, and I could go on and on. I have many more questions I could ask Barbara today about Pomodoro effects, motivation, consolidation, but they're all in her book and they're all in her course, and I suggest for you to all go out and take that. So Anna, I'm going to stop sharing now, and let's go to having questions from our attendees today.
Absolutely. This actually, I think is a nice segue from your last comment, Lori. But we have a question here. So suppose my class covers 10 chapters of material. Is it better, in your opinion, to test on each chapter right after we finish, or say 2 exams after 5 chapters? I find 2 exams are better as there's more time to let the material settle in and show other uses of earlier material. However, my colleagues seem to like 10 tests. Would love your opinion on that.
Very good question. So I would suggest combining the best of both worlds. One of students' most common and significant problems is procrastination. So depending on where you're teaching, if you're teaching at an elite university, you may not have as many problems with procrastination on students, but you might. But so weekly tests can actually really, students will still procrastinate, but they'll procrastinate in smaller chunks because they're forced to keep up on things. So if you combine small weekly quizzes that do count some with that sort of more comprehensive midterm final, I think that can be one of the best ways of hitting both things. Now, you may say, I have a lot of material to cover, and so I can't really cover it if I start reducing my class time by giving these smaller exams. And in that case, sometimes you just have to do your best to communicate the key ideas, but also give some extras that they are expected to learn on their own. One thing I found that was a real shocker for me is when I do flipped classes, if I really plan out my videos, I can teach in a much shorter, much more succinct way, so that it actually turns out I'm covering all the material I want to cover, and I still have time to give quizzes and so forth. I was shocked. Just by going through and eliminating my ums and ahs and occasional misdirections, I could compress my class time teaching by 1/3.
Wow. I think we've learned that too at LinkedIn Learning. We always call it the essential kernels of learning, because you're taking out the conversational and the face-to-face rapport and relationship so that you can get right to the heart of what you're trying to teach, or what you think is the essence there.
Mhm.
Anna, do we have some more questions?
Yes, we just had a question come in, a comment here. I think we have a big problem with focus, especially with staying long amounts of times in social media. How can we help manage this focus problem?
Oh, I've got a simple answer for you. Avoid social media. I mean, really, the answer is just to limit the time you spend on it, or, or just reduce it to the essentials. For example, LinkedIn, of course. But if you I really try to avoid most social media. In fact, the only social media I engage in is I belong to LinkedIn, and I look there, and I communicate with people via LinkedIn. I don't do anything on Facebook. I don't do anything on Twitter, and it really does free my time a lot. And in fact, one thing I really, and this is just honest truth. I'm not saying this, to be nice to LinkedIn, because I can be nasty to anyone, but what I found was that the connections I made on LinkedIn, they were really good professional connections, whereas I would say almost half of the connections I made or that were made with me, or that were tried to be made on Facebook, were things like, "Hi, how are you? You look pretty," that kind of thing. And so it's, I finally got so fed up with it that I just dropped Facebook, because it wasn't really a good professional. And I'm really interested in professional connections. Sure, there can be some chatting and so forth. So social media is a big problem. And so I recommend the work of Cal Newport. For example, his book, Deep Work, gives you some really good ideas about how to disconnect from the addiction that social media can provide.
Anna, we got any more questions?
We do. So we have a question here. We have largely moved to open book assignments, but increasingly I have found students seem to be less interested in long-term retention. Do you find there is still value in closed book assessments? For reference, I'm teaching electronics and electrical engineering.
I cannot recommend more strongly to avoid open book exams. I know that's been recommended by years by teaching experts, but what students do is they think they can look it up, and they hunt and peck. They can find a similar example. They don't actually take the time to learn the material. The nice thing is, if you have closed book exams, you can give simpler examinations that just test on the key ideas. And really, what do we want them to walk away with? We want them to have within their memory those key ideas. We don't want them to we don't want to have our exams be sort of a little esoteric, because otherwise, if it's too straightforward, they can just find a similar example in the worked examples of the book. So I strongly recommend some retrieval practice in the form of making students memorize key equations, and having them do examinations without having open book. Optimally, I would say, even without a cheat sheet. The challenge can be that without a cheat sheet, some students are going to just write some things on their hands, and it'll encourage them to cheat. So, optimally, to my mind, you have relatively straightforward tests that are not open book and no cheat sheet. But if you're really concerned that they might be able to slip things by you, then at least have one page or something like that.
So we have time, Anna, for one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up today.
Sounds great. So we just have a question here. What are we going to do about how intertwined university and college accreditation is with workplace hiring practices, and how online learning and self-learning isn't nearly as acceptable.
Well, it's, I think it's a gradual process. We're not going to be able to mandate that, that companies must accept certain forms of online learning. But at the same time, I think we're gradually beginning to see that some workplaces are beginning to accept that a university degree is not the only way to learning, especially things like boot camps, learning well via certain learning platforms like LinkedIn can really provide the knowledge that people actually need. One thing I've often found to be a bit irritating is that there's a lot of emphasis on, that you have to have sort of the people skills and, the social skills and so forth, and that's more important than, for example, your engineering skills. And I would beg to differ. For example, your technical skills that you can learn online that's the meat. If you can communicate socially, that's the gravy. If you don't have the meat, forget it. In fact, I was just talking with an MBA student at a highly prestigious university, and he said, I showed him I had all the social skills and so forth, and I had all the gravy, but they didn't hire me because I didn't have the meat. They hired a guy who had the meat. And I think that's something that we can all remember. I'm thrilled to see a university like Georgia Tech that actually has students in mind and created a Master of Computer Science program it costs around $6,600 for the entire program, as opposed to the $40,000, which is typical of their face-to-face program and most masters in computer science at good universities. So they created this really super inexpensive program. And it turns out, like, if you go to Georgia Tech and you get a degree, your master's degree in computer science, it doesn't say master's degree, but they got it online. And it turns out that the two are fully equivalent. They've tested out the capability of those who learned online with those who learned face-to-face, fully equivalent in their capabilities once they came out of the course. As a consequence, Georgia Tech's, they have the largest master's program, it is thought, in the world. And they've captured 10% of the market of computer science master's degrees in the US. So I think that universities better start kind of running a little scared and working more with companies to create good low-cost professional programs, because those universities that do that early on are going to be the ones that capture the bulk of the market for years to come.
I think it's super important. We have a lot of data on it at LinkedIn Learning about that, almost 2/3 of the learners in public universities and community colleges are working learners. They don't have the luxury of spending 4 years and $40,000 per year in a residential program. And so Georgia Tech actually targeting and identifying that group and understanding their needs and accommodating their situation makes it easier for them to accomplish what other students can do through a residential school in 4 years. I think we were too hung up on 4 years and out, kind of without thinking other alternative environments for learning and teaching. I'm going to go back to share my screen one more time as we wrap up. We have covered a lot today. And as I said, Barbara could talk for hours on this subject, and she's written so many books about this as well. I wanted to leave you that she does have numerous free Creative Commons things that are available. Your 10 top ideas to help you with learning, just post those in your classroom or hand them out day one to your students. Really, really good. And then 10 pitfalls to avoid in learning. Barbara talked about a few of those, but I want you to know there are lots of things on Barbara's website that can help the teacher. So Barbara, I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to share with us as we wrap up today. Any closing thoughts?
Oh, I'm so thrilled to be able to share with you. There's lots and lots of information out there. There was a question about what about information overload, as far as, there being too much. And what I say is, for example, go to LinkedIn Learning. They have a lot of really world-class learning materials. Try to see what other learners have said about things. Another good source to look at is a company named Class Central, which actually has evaluations of courses. So whatever you're wanting to go in, or whatever you're wanting to study, it's how good the teacher is. That's what's important. And then pick something that's got a good teacher, got good evaluations, and then just set yourself up personally with some kind of program, like over the next 5 weeks, I will devote, 3 hours a week, and get in mind exactly when you will do that. And that will really help with your success. Just envisioning how you're going to complete something that you want to study that has a good teacher.
I think you're so right about that. I've taken a lot of courses on every platform, and I always try to pick my teacher, hopefully with the subject matter I'm interested in, but I find that I get a lot more out of it if it's a good, inspired, well thought curriculum and well-developed content. Thank you so much, Barbara, for joining us today. I know this woman just came back from California, 2 days of being on the road and speaking to universities all over California. It means such a lot for us. And I hope that I see all of you attendees at the next Higher Education Leaders event. It's going to be an interview with Michael Berman on March 24th, again on Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 11 p.m. Eastern time, and I hope you join us. Michael Berman is the CIO for California State University system-wide. That's 23 universities. He's been in higher ed. We met each other, I'll tell you, 30 years ago, we met each other when he was the CIO at Art Center, and he's moved on and been in the systems. He has a lot to say about what the future of education holds for all of us. I hope you do attend. And for all our future and past events and for getting recordings, you can go to this website, highereducationleaders.com. And that's a wrap today. Again, let's all give Barbara a great clap, and thank you so much for all that you've done.